Jujutsu Kaisen is no stranger to character deaths. While many of its contemporaries struggle to give even permanent consequences to their characters, Akutame Gege has consistently broken convention by frequently and unpredictably killing off characters within his series. Due to this, one of the major criticisms of Jujutsu Kaisen is that it relies too much on shock value to carry its deaths, essentially meaning that Gege simply uses death as a way to get a reaction out of the audience, rather than actually adding to his narrative. Other accusations state that he's misogynist or negligent based on the character being killed. There are a lot of them out there. What do I believe? Well, it varies. While there are some undeniably poorly written deaths in the series, I believe there are an equal amount of phenomenal and touching ones as well. So in this video, I'm going to be ranking every single character death within the series. And by every, I mean every named or important character. I won't be ranking Shibuya Civilian number 482, for example. I'll be rating them on a tier list format, F being the lowest, representing meaningless, unimportant, or horribly executed deaths, while S is the highest, representing impactful, touching, and well-written deaths. I'll be splitting the rankings into segments based on timeline, going pre-main story, pre-Shibuya, and then the Shibuya incident, as well as going through the characters in chronological order of death. Before we start, from analytics, I can tell that a lot of you are returning viewers, who have probably watched a couple of my videos by now. So if you could, please subscribe. It's completely free and it will only take a second of your time, but help me out a bunch. Thank you. Without further ado, let's get started. Misato Kuroi. Starting off with the first chronological death in the timeline of the series, we have Riko's caretaker. If you don't remember this death, I don't blame you. Toji encountered and subsequently landed a mortal blow on her off-screen, before hinting towards the vague nature of her death. Small spoiler for chapter 265, but it was only hundreds of chapters later that we realized this had killed her. Despite the chance for an emotional death as Riko's only family member is killed, it is instead relegated to being off-screen. Due to the complete lack of emotion or even importance around her death, this is a comfortable F tier. Riko Amanai. Let's not waste any time here. Riko has one of the most emotional deaths within the entire series. From setup to execution, everything about Riko's eventual death is astounding. As the clutch of the hidden inventory arc, Riko's death has incredible plot significance, as while it didn't have as much of an effect on the world as we were led to believe, it did have a profound effect on some of the most important characters within the series. But let's talk about the actual death itself. Through the entire arc, the audience had become comfortable with the fact that, regardless of the outcome, by the end of this, Riko would cease to be in one way or another. However, in those final moments, rather than having an assured demise, Geto reaches out to her, telling her it's alright to live and it's up to her whether they go through this or not. Riko, despite what we've known about her so far, chooses life and rejects the notion of becoming a sacrifice for Tengen. And at the very climax of her desire to live, her life is cruelly and suddenly snuffed out. A lot of people defend Gege's deaths by saying they're realistic. However, this is one of the few times where the tragedy and suddenness of a character's passing genuinely feels real. Easy S tier. Toji Fushiguro, Part 1. Hidden Inventory really gave us back-to-back bangers. Honestly, it might be one of my favorite arcs in the entire series. Toji's character serves as an amazing parallel to Gojo's within the scope of the arc. A man who had nothing, treated as trash by the clan around him, against the most gifted and blessed man within the values of their society. Despite this, however, Toji overwhelms Gojo, winning in their initial clash by taking advantage of his biggest flaw, his hubris. This, however, leads to Gojo's enlightenment, learning to free himself from everything that bound him. Toji is faced with the reflection of everything he tried to deny, and in this moment, Gojo's divinity is the culmination of the entire society that rejected him. Thus, Toji loses for the same reason that Gojo did: hubris. He refused to believe he was beneath him. He refused to let the society that trampled on him his entire life get the better of him again, and because of this, he dies. A simple and clean S-tier death. Haibara is the type of character who exists purely to die, to fuel others. He doesn't get much in terms of scene time or characterization. However, he's an important aspect of Nanami's backstory and his eventual outlook on sorcery. Still not much to say here in terms of his death, so F tier. Rika's death is interesting, as due to Yuta refusing to let go of her spirit, she is essentially on the halfway point for the entirety of Volume 0. The course of the entire movie follows Yuta trying to make sense and eventually come to terms with Rika's sudden death, believing she had bound herself to him when in actuality he had bound himself to her. The cursed spirit Rika represents this powerful inability to let go, and so the final scene of Yuta learning to love what haunted him is essentially the same as him coming to terms with her death. Then and finally then can Rika's spirit move on from him, through a touching goodbye at the end of the movie. If you're just taking her death at face value, then it's probably a B tier, but if you take the symbolism of her death through Rika, the cursed spirit, as well, and stretch it over the course of the entire movie, then it's probably high A tier. Geto Suguru. Despite being a pivotal aspect of Gojo's story, in order to truly appreciate Geto's death, one has to watch all of Hidden Inventory first, making it a bit awkward for the average fan who watched the movie before Season 2 came out. However, assuming you consume this story in chronological order, you're able to grasp the full tragedy that comes from Geto's death. Unable to accept a world where he and his loved ones must suffer at the cost of those deemed lesser than himself, Geto becomes hyper-fixated on cleansing the world of non-sorcerers, leading to his eventual downfall and defeat at the hands of Yuta Okkotsu. Yuta is a person who believed in his friends and the relationships he had formed, while Geto is one who threw away all of his bonds in search of a greater goal. In the end, it is the one true person who understood him that stands over his body, being the one to deliver the final blow. I think that's a high B tier death. Wasuke Itadori. Wasuke's death serves the role of Yuji's motivator for the first core of the series. While we don't get to learn much of him as a character, his passing words to die surrounded by people are what drive Yuji's hero complex, and his initial mindset when going into Jujutsu of giving people a proper death. In more recent chapters of the manga though, we've gotten a bit of extra contextualization that I find interesting. Spoilers for the latest chapter. As Yuji explains his mindset and past to Sukuna, he goes over a detail of Wasuke coming back to the city to visit a funeral for a friend, and consider whether that friend would have come to see Wasuke had he died first. This begs the question of why Wasuke died alone. Was it truly because of the lack of effort he put into others' lives, or was it plain bad luck due to the longevity of his own life? With this, the final words given to Yuji come into question as well. A proper death isn't what is important. The value of one's life comes not in making it proper, but rather being able to appreciate the little fragments of living life itself. And I believe that's what drives Yuji's change in mindset as he finally sinks Sukuna into the grave. While interesting to analyze, Wasuke is still overall a mid-B tier death. Nagi Yoshino. A classic shonen mom, another character who exists to die. The necessary trigger to push Junpei over the edge. While not incredibly important, she serves as the last thing tying Junpei down to his humanities and morals, so much so that Yuji doesn't even question Junpei's rage when he learns of her passing. Decent death, mid-C tier. Junpei Yoshino. While people don't exactly respect the character, Junpei's death is still an incredibly important aspect of Yuji's character development. As someone who watched the anime to start with, I have to say the point when Junpei died was the biggest indication that Jujutsu Kaisen would be unlike most other shonen series, where he would have simply been redeemed and put into the main cast, like the opening almost seemed to acknowledge and lead into. Rather, Junpei suffered a cruel and sudden demise, betrayed by Mahito on the cusp of redemption. This was one of the biggest cracks in Yuji's hero complex, and also taught him the necessary lesson that no matter how much you value someone, sometimes their deaths will be cruel, tragic, and nonsensical. It also started the audience's hate train on Mahito, so that's a plus. High B tier. Ketchizu. Ketchizu's death mainly serves as a drive for Choso, and his initial hatred for Yuji for killing his brothers. Later on, Ketsu's death is highlighted as the ramification of Choso's choice of choosing the easier way out and living like a curse rather than a human, losing both of his brothers in the process. Ketsu's death also highlighted some of Nobara's more sadistic tendencies in combat, and was also just a point of character growth for her. But still, he was a nothing burger character, so low D tier. Eso. Eso hits most of the same points as Ketsu, being a drive and punishment for Choso and whatnot. However, Eso ended on a more emotional note due to him shedding tears upon seeing Ketsu's death. More so than Ketsu, this allows us to see the humanity within Eso, driving in the point that Yuji is not simply killing curses here, but actual individuals with human emotions who care for each other. So, high C tier death. Kokichi Muta. It's incredible how Gege can take a character most of the audience had forgotten or hardly cared for, then recontextualize them to become fleshed out within his story. Mekamaru's battle with Mahito not only represents an immense struggle to survive, but also a chance for atonement, fighting to the very end in order to spend even one moment with his friends. Even when his body dies, he still lives on throughout the Shibuya arc, delivering a painful goodbye to the friends and found family he had tried so hard to defend. Hell, for a moment, he even made Miwa seem like an important character, and if that's no impressive, I don't know what is. An absolute A tier death. Hanami. Hanami represents the beginning of an unfortunate trend for the disaster curses. That is, unfortunately, having their final moments being boiled down to showcasing how much stronger another character is. Hanami's death was certainly cool, showing how brutal and ruthless Gojo could be even in tight situations, but there was almost no writing to it. D tier, maybe even F. Kogai. Very similar to Hanami, dies in order to show Yuji's growth and strength. Absolutely nothing to say here, F tier. Dagon. Again, died to make Toji look cool. However, there's a little more to Dagon's characterization in his final moments. A big aspect of Dagon's character is how cursed spirits were individuals, with their own names and identities. So Jogo respecting his ashes as he fades away is a good recall to this theme behind his personality. I'd say this makes his death better than Hanami's at least. Maybe high D tier or low C tier. Ogami. An unimportant antagonist, though when you look at her backstory in the data books, you realize how much she deserved a worse death. F tier. Toji Fushiguro Part 2. His second life and subsequent second death. Toji's character is a lot less interesting in his revival due to his nature as an agent of chaos who simply desires to face the strong. Thus, his strongest character moment is in his death, showing an aspect of humanity when finally recalling his son, proud to learn he had kept his surname and ending his own life in order to spare him. It's a very touching scene. However, my biggest issue with this moment is how Megumi never once questions who this guy is. Like, he genuinely appeared, soloed a special grade, almost killed him, suddenly ended himself, and then refused to elaborate, and Megumi has zero questions? Yeah, that kinda sinks it down. B tier death. Mimiko Hasaba and Nanako Hasaba. The only thing that makes these deaths good is how absolutely jarring it is to see Sukuna thoughtlessly slaughter two high school girls. It highlights his overwhelming cruelty and malevolence, but doesn't do more than that. Honestly, alongside with the rest of Geto's crew, it just goes to highlight how much that faction was underutilized in the main story. D tier. Jogo. Now, much like Hanami and Dagon, Jogo died to make Sukuna look cool. But while those two fell flat in the writing department, Jogo's passing was actually exceptional. A great summary to his characterization, trying to prove that cursed spirits are the truer humans. Sukuna reveals to him that this mindset was holding him back all along, and if he had simply let go and burned everything around him, he would have reached the heights of even Gojo Satoru. Jogo's death also highlights an important aspect of Sukuna's character. While on the surface he may seem one-dimensionally evil and sadistic, he has a real sense of honor for those who try to face him, honoring them in their final moments. An otherwise great scene. A tier. Haruta Shigemo. While many deaths are emotional, there are some characters who you simply hope Gege gets rid of. Haruta is one of them. From a more meta perspective, the entire point of his character comes from the fact that the audience wants him to die, but he somehow continuously keeps surviving. Until finally, his luck runs out and the audience finally gets what they're waiting for, a long overdue and satisfying death. Still C tier. Kento Nanami. Without a doubt, one of the best, if not the best deaths within the entire series. Wonderful in the manga and made 1,000 times better in the anime. A culmination of Nanami's entire character. Despite being a dead man walking, he still pursues his purpose as a Jujutsu sorcerer, facing off against the threats around him. In his final moments, gaining a vision of Haibara, he gains the strength to push the next generation on, entrusting his role as a Jujutsu sorcerer into Yuji's hands. This scene is emotional enough, but there's a narrative I think most fans missed. Before dying, Nanami imagines himself in Malaysia, as it had always been his wish to retire there, though this is simply a facade, a hallucination before death. Meanwhile, Mei, an objectively worse and more selfish character, is later seen in Malaysia in a well-known questionable scene. This perfectly highlights the cruelty of Jujutsu society. Those who sacrifice themselves for purpose gain nothing, while those who hedonistically heed their own desires end up thriving in the end. If that isn't good writing and world building, I don't know what is. S tier death. Nobara Kugisaki. Well, I sure know what isn't good writing. In a bubble, Nobara's death is pretty good actually. We get to know more details about her backstory as well as what defines her rebellious attitude. Her last words are extremely emotional, and the visual metaphor of having limited seats in her life for the people close to her and then seeing Yuji and the others barge in unexpectedly, making her life better, was great. Amazing symbolism. However, when placed within the context of the story, her death is subpar at best. It's too close to Nanami's death to hit as hard and almost feels like it was added on top of that for the extra shock value. The biggest issue most people, me included, had with her death was how incredibly vague it was. Manga spoilers real quick, it's been hundreds of chapters and she still hasn't shown up, so most fans, me included, have simply accepted the fact that well, never mind. I'm happy, but really, Gege, 30 minutes before she was needed, she woke up? Come on, man, this just feels like a deus ex machina. Like, I love it, but I have to criticize it at the same time. Still, if I'm gonna rate the death in quotations, I'd give it a B tier. Mahito. One of the most awaited and satisfying villain deaths within the entire series. Similar to Haruta's whole thing of wanting him to die, but this time with an actually well-written and engaging villain. To see Mahito crawling away, begging for his life after everything he had done to Yuji's friends is incredibly satisfying, and his portrayal as a rabbit while Yuji is portrayed as a wolf just further symbolizes the hunter and hunted dynamic between the two of them. My favorite aspect of this though is how Yuji doesn't win by proving that lives are inherently special. He has to sink down to Mahito's frame of reference to win, and I love this. Cause while Mahito might have lost the physical battle, in a way, he won the battle of ideals, and Yuji would stick with his non-important cog mentality for a vast majority of the series after this. Wonderful villain, S tier. And that's the list, from the anime anyway. If you want to see part 2 covering the manga, just let me know. For now, that'll be all. If you liked the video, remember to hit the like button, and hey, if you're a fan of my content, I'll take a donation as a subscriber too. Regardless, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.